On a bright day, along a quiet country road, Frank was driving with the windows down, enjoying the fresh air. As he turned a corner, he noticed something unusual up ahead. There, walking alongside the road, was a large Labrador, seemingly out of place. Frank, being a dog lover, couldn't just drive by without checking on the poor creature. The dog stopped Frank, almost as if it was asking for help. Out of curiosity, Frank decided to follow the dog, which led him into the deep woods. And, well, he paid dearly for that decision. Out in the middle of nowhere, Frank felt a bit confused seeing the dog all alone. They were far from town, and Frank was only here because he was on a 6-hour drive to visit his mother in a neighboring city. He looked around, seeing no farms or houses nearby. There was nothing to explain where the dog might have come from. No owner, no one else around. It was obvious this poor creature had been left all by itself, and Frank, being the kind-hearted person he was, couldn't just leave it there. He knew he had no choice but to quickly call 911. Frank pulled over and rolled down his window. Immediately, the dog placed its front paws on the door, catching Frank a little off guard. Clearly, the dog was familiar with cars and people. Frank guessed that the animal couldn't have made it out here without a vehicle. On closer inspection, it was apparent the dog was well cared for. Around its neck was a large collar, suggesting it had an owner somewhere. Now, Frank faced a decision. What on earth was he supposed to do with this dog? It clearly wanted his attention. At first, he thought it might want to climb into the car. But when he opened the back door, the dog stepped back a few paces and barked at Frank. Not in distress, but as if it was trying to tell him something. The bark was more of a call for attention than an alarm. Frank wasn't sure what to do next. He wanted to help the dog, especially since he was becoming more convinced it was all alone. The only solution he could think of was to get the dog into his truck and take it to the nearest animal shelter. They could send out a notice that the dog had been found, hoping to track down its owner. But no matter how hard Frank tried, the dog wouldn't get into his truck. In fact, it wouldn't even let Frank touch it, almost as if it was afraid he might grab it and force it into the car. Frank could have decided then and there that this wasn't worth his time and continued on his way. But something held him back. By now, Frank understood what this strange animal wanted. It wanted him to follow. Every time Frank took a step toward the dog took a step too, always in the same direction. This dog wanted to lead him somewhere, and Frank's curiosity grew. He glanced in the direction the dog seemed intent on heading. It quickly became clear that wherever the dog wanted to go, he wouldn't be able to drive there. This was a journey to be made on foot. Frank took a deep breath, locked his car, and headed in the direction where the dog seemed intent on leading him. Almost immediately, it became clear that the animal appreciated his decision. The dog wagged its tail and kept glancing back at Frank with a joyful expression on its face. The animal guided him exactly where it wanted to go, yet Frank was left with more questions than answers. He had already texted his mother that he would be a little late, but he had no idea how long this unexpected expedition would take. They walked across an open field, with Frank trailing behind the eager Labrador. As they approached the dense forest, the simplicity of the terrain was deceiving. It hinted at the challenges that lay ahead. Tall trees cast long shadows, foreshadowing the unknown path they were about to take. The dog, with its tail held high, confidently forged ahead, pushing through the underbrush that marked the boundary between the familiar and the mysterious wilderness. As the forest canopy thickened, Frank's steps became more hesitant. The bright daylight barely filtered through the leaves, casting a dim twilight over the path below. He could hear rustling and distant cries from unseen creatures, a stark reminder of the wild territory he had entered. The trail, if it could even be called that, twisted deeper into the woods, its turns dictated by the dog's determined pace. In the quiet of the forest, Frank noticed a change. The dog, which had been keeping its distance, now allowed Frank to get closer. This newfound trust was evident as the dog frequently paused, glancing back to ensure Frank was still with him. Their silent bond strengthened with each step, bridging the gap between man and animal, companion and guide. With this growing trust, Frank saw his opportunity. Quickly, he reached out and managed to grab hold of the dog's collar. The dog, caught by surprise, froze but did not pull away. Frank's fingers traced the edges of the collar and found something engraved on the inside. The name, Bob. There were no other identifying details, but something hard and unfamiliar pressed beneath the collar, piquing Frank's curiosity. Feeling the solid object under the collar, his interest only deepened. He knew that the key to unraveling Bob's mysterious journey lay with this hidden item. Determined, Frank decided it was time to investigate further. His trusty pocket knife, always ready for unexpected adventures, was now in hand. Frank carefully used his knife to open the part of the collar that seemed unusual. Inside, wrapped in fabric, was a small, delicate device. Its metallic surface glistened faintly in the dim light filtering through the trees. Frank turned it over in his hands, inspecting the ports and buttons, quickly realizing that it was far more intricate than a simple tag or tracker. At first glance, Frank assumed it must be a tracking device. That made sense, considering Bob had been wandering alone. The thought that Bob's owner could pinpoint his location at any time gave Frank a brief sense of relief. It explained why Bob seemed so confident and determined in his wanderings. But as Frank examined the device further, doubts began to creep in about his initial assumption. The mystery deepened. Frank knew he had to follow Bob further into the woods to uncover the truth. The dog, now trusting and eager, led the way with renewed determination. Frank, driven by curiosity and a sense of responsibility, followed closely behind, ready to face whatever lay ahead. As we venture deeper into the woods, the air grows cooler, and the sounds of the forest become more pronounced. Each step takes us further from the familiar and closer to the unknown. It's a place where time seems to stand still, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig could mean something significant. Will we find what we're looking for, or will the mysteries of the deep woods remain unsolved? Suddenly, there it is, a glint of metal among the fallen leaves. It's Bob's collar, unmistakable with its worn leather and engraved tag. This discovery brings a mix of relief and concern. What happened here? Where is Bob now? The collar is a clue, but it also raises more questions than it answers. The search must continue, but now with a renewed sense of urgency. As we examine the area more closely, we notice something unusual partially buried under the dirt. Carefully, we dig it out and find a small, hidden device. It's unlike anything we've seen before, with blinking lights and intricate wiring. This device could be the key to understanding what happened, but it also suggests a level of complexity and danger we hadn't anticipated. The plot thickens, and our resolve strengthens. We must get to the bottom of this. Assumption his curiosity wouldn't let him walk away so easily. Upon closer inspection, Frank noticed features that didn't align with a standard tracker. There were no visible GPS coordinates, nor were there blinking lights indicating the transmission or reception of a signal. Instead, Frank found a small speaker and a micro USB port, suggesting that the device was meant for recording rather than tracking. It dawned on him then, this wasn't a tracker at all, it was a recorder. This revelation raised an unsettling question. Why would someone need to record what a dog sees or hears? The forest around was silent apart from the natural sounds of wildlife. The notion that Bob's adventures were being documented baffled Frank. It seemed peculiar for an ordinary pet. As he studied the device, Frank noticed a function he had overlooked, the ability to transmit. That meant the device didn't just record, it could also send out those recordings. The implication was chilling. Could someone be listening to their movements and conversations right now? A shiver ran down Frank's spine at the thought. Yet this discovery only deepened the mystery of why Bob was in these woods. Holding the device, Frank felt as though he was at the center of a puzzle with missing pieces. The recorder hidden in Bob's collar hinted at a purpose far beyond simple surveillance. It seemed Bob was part of something larger, something secret. This discovery didn't deter Frank. On the contrary, it fueled his resolve to uncover the truth behind Bob's solitary journey through the woods. Despite the unease gnawing at him, Frank made up his mind to stay with Bob. The dog's determination and the enigma of the recorder spurred him to see this adventure through to the end. Bob, oblivious to Frank's inner turmoil, continued to forge ahead with unflagging enthusiasm. Frank couldn't shake the feeling that they were heading towards something significant, something that Bob seemed to understand, but that remained just out of Frank's grasp. The thick underbrush of the forest made their progress slow and laborious. Yet Bob navigated it with ease, choosing paths that Frank would have overlooked on his own. Every confident step Bob took revealed how familiar he was with these trails, making Frank wonder how many times the dog had embarked on this journey before. The forest, with its deep shadows and tangled vines, held secrets that Bob seemed to understand perfectly. Bob led Frank through the forest with the ease of a seasoned guide. The paths he chose were the cleanest and least obstructed, a clear sign of his deep familiarity with the area. Frank marveled at how instinctively Bob moved, always finding the simplest route. This level of expertise suggested that these walks were a regular occurrence, a routine that took Bob through these woods far more often than Frank could have imagined. As they ventured deeper into the forest, Frank remained on high alert. The tape recorder attached to Bob's collar added a layer of mystery to their journey, turning every rustle and shadow into a potential sign of danger. Frank's senses were heightened, nervous about what might lie ahead. Bob, however, seemed completely unfazed, walking forward with the confidence of someone who knew these woods well. Frank couldn't help but wonder what awaited them. Suddenly, Frank's phone rang, cutting through the stillness of the forest with a sharp sound. Glancing at the screen, he was stunned to see his mother's name flashing. "How do I even have service here?" he muttered aloud as he answered the call. His mother's voice, clear and concerned, was the last thing he expected to hear during this peculiar adventure. "What are you up to?" she asked, sensing his breathless greeting. Frank hesitated, then explained the strange tale of Bob and the mysterious device. There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. His mother, always quick to offer advice or a comforting word, fell silent, and her reaction only heightened Frank's unease. When she finally spoke, her voice was laced with concern. "I've heard about that dog," she admitted. Her words were slow, deliberate. It sounded like something out of a local legend. Frank stopped in his tracks, gripping the phone tighter. The thought that Bob could be part of a local myth was both intriguing and unsettling. His mother's next words came with such reluctance that a chill ran down Frank's spine. According to the story, the dog lured children into the forest, where they were never found again. Frank froze, the only sounds around him being the rustle of leaves and distant cries of wild animals. Despite the seriousness of his mother's warning, Frank couldn't help but smile. "It's just a coincidence," he reassured, more to calm himself than to dispute the legend. Bob was right there, tangible and real, quietly breathing at his feet. The idea that he was following a ghost from local folklore seemed absurd. Yet, as he continued on, that laugh did nothing to shake the growing sense of dread. As the conversation with his mother came to an end, Frank promised her, "I'll be careful." He tried to sound confident, but the story she had told lingered in his mind. Despite his skepticism toward the urban legend, he couldn't ignore the mounting anxiety. Bob kept moving forward, seemingly indifferent to the shift in Frank's mood, guiding them deeper into the forest's embrace. Walking behind Bob, Frank's unease grew. The dog's path started winding unpredictably through the forest, no longer following any discernible trail. The randomness of their route unsettled Frank. The trees all began to look the same, and the absence of clear landmarks made him realize just how far they had deviated from the familiar path. The adventure had taken a disturbing turn, causing Frank to question Bob's intentions. The realization hit him hard. They had long since lost their way. Panic surged as Frank came to terms with the fact that he might not know how to find his way back. The forest, once a thrilling mystery, now felt like a labyrinth designed to confuse and trap. Frank's trust in Bob wavered as the weight of their isolation became undeniable. Deciding that he had gone far enough, Frank came to a halt. He turned toward the direction they had come from, determined to retrace his steps and return to familiar ground. The excitement of following Bob had vanished, replaced by an urgent need to get back to where he felt safe. Bob, however, did not take kindly to Frank's decision to leave. The dog's once friendly and welcoming bark turned loud and aggressive. The sudden change startled Frank, freezing him in place. He glanced back at Bob, confusion and worry clouding his eyes. Had he made a mistake by trying to leave? The sudden change in Bob's behavior signaled that more was at stake than Frank had originally realized. When Frank tried to walk away, Bob darted in front of him, blocking his path with newfound aggression. Frank's heart pounded wildly in his chest. The once friendly dog he had followed was now an insurmountable obstacle. Bob's eyes locked with his, filled with an intensity Frank had never noticed before. The shift from companion to adversary was sharp and terrifying, casting a shadow of fear over Frank. Bob's lips curled back, revealing his teeth as he slowly advanced toward Frank. The dog's growl echoed through the silent forest, sending chills down Frank's spine. This was not the Bob he knew. The aggressive stance and deliberate movement forward made it clear he felt threatened. Frank's instincts screamed at him to run from the approaching danger. With no other choice, Frank turned and sprinted. He picked a direction, any direction, driven purely by instinct to escape the menacing presence behind him. Bob followed, but to Frank's surprise, he began to outrun the dog. The dense forest blurred around him as adrenaline fueled his desperate flight. The sounds of pursuit gradually faded, giving him a glimmer of hope. 10 minutes felt like an eternity, but the frantic pounding of his heart finally began to slow. Frank could no longer hear Bob's barking or the sound of paws chasing him. He stopped, catching his breath, and listened. The forest around him was silent. The silence was so deep it was almost deafening. For a moment he allowed himself to believe he had escaped immediate danger. As his breathing steadied, a fleeting sense of relief washed over him. Looking around, he realized he had no idea where he was. The trees offered no clues, and the path he had been following was long lost. A sinking feeling settled in his stomach. Had his mother's warning been prophetic? The legend had become a reality for an unsuspecting traveler. Fear mingled with regret as he stood alone in the endless wilderness, contemplating his next move. Pulling out his phone, Frank hoped for a weak signal, but there were no bars on the screen. The tenuous connection he had clung to was now gone. The isolation pressed down on him like a heavy weight, and the realization began to sink in. He was utterly alone. The device that connected him to the outside world was now just a useless piece of metal and plastic in his hand. As the sun sank lower, shadows stretched across the forest floor, signaling the approach of night. Panic seized Frank at the thought of being caught in the dark. He needed to find shelter, but he stood frozen, unsure of where to go. The vast, indifferent forest offered no guidance, only the certainty that he would spend the night in the darkness. Forcing himself to move, Frank wandered aimlessly through the thickening dusk. His eyes strained to pierce the gloom, searching for any kind of refuge in the increasingly hostile surroundings. The thought of spending the night defenseless against the elements and whatever else might lurk in the forest sent shivers down his spine. Every rustle, every snap of a branch beneath his feet amplified his sense of vulnerability. Just as despair began to take hold, a faint light pierced the darkness ahead. The light grew brighter against the backdrop of the night. The glow led Frank to a small cabin, its windows casting a warm, inviting glow into the wilderness. As he approached, the details of the cabin became clearer. Wooden walls, a simple door, and the soft rustle of smoke from the chimney. A flicker of hope ignited in Frank's soul, making him believe he might have found sanctuary. Drawn by the light within, he neared the window and raised his hand to knock, but caution took hold, stopping him in his tracks. Isolation and his recent trials with Bob had taught him to value caution. He pondered the unknown nature of the cabin's inhabitants. Were they the friendly refuge he hoped for, or something far more sinister? Choosing to be careful, Frank crouched beneath the window, using the faint glow of his phone to discreetly capture the interior. He sought a glimpse of who or what was inside without drawing attention to his presence. The quiet of the night concealed his movements, allowing him to gather clues unnoticed. As Frank reviewed the footage, his heart raced as he processed the scene captured on his phone. He realized a child of about 5 years old was sleeping on the floor all alone. How could he survive in a place like this? Frank wondered if the house was more of a warehouse without the warmth of a family. He was stunned, wondering if this had been Bob's goal from the start. After watching the video, realizing the gravity of his discovery, Frank knew he needed to leave immediately. But the baby, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Suddenly, his phone signaled Wi-Fi access. It was a lifeline he hadn't expected, coming from the very place he now sought to escape. Without a second thought, Frank connected to the cabin's Wi-Fi. His first move was to dial 911 via the internet, desperately trying to alert anyone who could assist. Once the connection was made, Frank typed out his predicament, shared the video and his location with the operator. The chat window became a small beacon of hope in the overwhelming darkness. His fingers moved rapidly, detailing the events that had led him there, praying this digital plea would bring the help he so desperately needed. The bright glow of his screen was his only source of light as a disturbance inside the cabin shattered the night's silence. In an instant, his connection to the outside world was severed, the Wi-Fi cut off. Panic surged through Frank as he heard the door fly open and someone barked a sharp command, "Get him!" The sounds of pursuit filled the air, driving him into immediate flight. Adrenaline fueled his legs as he bolted into the darkness, away from the cabin, away from the voices. But what truly terrified him was the sound of a familiar bark. Bob had joined the chase. As he weaved between the trees, a glance over his shoulder confirmed his worst fear. It was Bob. His form was a shadow against the lesser darkness, driven by either anger or command. The dog he once knew, now turned into a weapon, was relentless in its pursuit. Bob's growls and the rapid thumping of his paws on the forest floor echoed close behind, too close. Realizing the futility of running in the engulfing darkness, Frank stopped, turning to face the charging dog. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of resignation and fear. He braced himself for the impact, for Bob's teeth. This was the moment of truth, the one he had hoped would never come. The night seemed to hold its breath as man and dog stood on the edge of an abyss. When Bob's teeth came just inches from Frank, his aggressive demeanor shifted. Instead of biting, he paused, twitching his nose as he sniffed Frank, and a flicker of recognition passed through his eyes. The dog, who had been chasing him with such fervor, now hesitated, torn between commands and memories. Bob's growl faded as he recognized Frank. The tension in his body lessened, and the aggression was replaced with curiosity as he sniffed everything around him, confirming a familiarity. Frank, with a wave of relief, realized that Bob saw him not as a threat, but as a friend, someone he had walked with before. The bond between them, however brief, had left its mark on the dog. Thinking quickly, Frank tore a piece of his shirt, grimacing as he used it to wipe the blood trickling from a scratch on his knee. He needed Bob to return to the cabin to avoid further pursuit. Carefully, he placed the bloodied rag in Bob's mouth, hoping the dog would interpret it as a deceptive token, a false sign of victory. Bob, understanding or merely obeying, took the rag and turned back towards the cabin. As the sound of his retreat faded, Frank found himself once again enveloped in silence and darkness. Now all he could do was wait for the signal of rescue, praying that his message would bring the help he desperately needed. The quiet of the night was shattered by the distant hum of helicopter blades, and soon Frank heard voices calling his name. The nightmare was finally over. The police moved swiftly and silently. Finally, the child was successfully rescued. The mysterious man was arrested. As they were handcuffed by the police, Frank heard him curse Bob, the dog. In the stillness of the early morning at the police station, there was a buzz of activity as officers escorted Frank, Bob, and the suspect. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation as the night's events were about to be unraveled. As they walked through the corridors, Frank felt a mix of relief and apprehension, while Bob remained by his side, seemingly aware of the gravity of the situation. In the interrogation room, Frank recounted his harrowing story, detailing everything from his encounter with Bob to the discovery of the cabin. When questioned, the man barely spoke, offering little to refute the evidence that had been gathered. The items and trophies found in his home spoke volumes, painting a clear picture of his illicit activities in the forest. The investigation revealed the man's involvement in a sinister child kidnapping ring, where they used Bob to lure unsuspecting children into the woods. This man had turned the wildland into a hunting ground for young victims, exploiting Bob's skills for his own gain. The evidence of his illegal actions was undeniable, sealing his fate in the eyes of the law. Bob, the dog who had once been a pawn in this man's unlawful deeds, finally received recognition for his exceptional training. His ability to lure people, a skill honed by his owner, was now transformed into a tool of justice, something Frank himself had experienced firsthand. The revelation of Bob's training and his unwitting role in the criminal schemes cast a new light on the dog's actions and his innate intelligence. With his owner likely facing criminal charges, attention turned towards Bob's future. The police, moved by the dog's story and Frank's bond with him, were hopeful as they looked for a new home for Bob. He needed a place where his intelligence and skills could be used for good, possibly even in service. As the investigation neared its conclusion, everyone hoped that Bob would soon begin a new chapter, free from the shadows of his past. What an incredible journey from a seemingly innocent roadside encounter to uncovering a chilling child abduction ring in the depths of the forest. Frank's experience with Bob took us on an emotional roller coaster. It's a story of courage, survival, and the unexpected bond between man and dog. Bob, once used for evil, found redemption in the end, and now has a chance to use his intelligence for good. And remember, sometimes even the smallest, most unexpected moments can lead us to uncovering the truth. Stay curious, stay safe, and until next time, take care.